Hi again then guys, and welcome to another episode of Beards and Cars. For those who are perhaps new to this series, this is a podcast style series where we talk about topics related lately quite a lot to Gran Turismo Sport, because those are of course topical both in general and specifically to the channel. Sometimes we talk about YouTube or go on off on a rant basically like last week, and it's just a more informal setting. It's not quite as strict as a review or a tune setup or a rivals match. As I said, it's just a little bit more easygoing, more of a discussion where you can reply in the comments, put stuff that you'd like to talk about in future ones, all that kind of good stuff. Now, as you saw from the title, of course, what I wanted to discuss this week is something which I know a lot of you guys have a lot of interest in, for obvious reasons, and something which is a great discussion to have, because although you could have conjecture in this category of the game, Gran Turismo Sport in particular, it's not necessarily something which you can really confirm or deny for the most part. Which is kind of a good thing, kind of not, because it means you can't say anything for sure, but you also can't necessarily deny it for sure either. Now, of course, the FIA involvement in the game is going to play a big factor as to whether or not any of these categories of racing will ever return. I think some of them definitely have a strong chance, and others, I would say, based on the past of the franchise especially, don't have as much of a chance. Now, I've narrowed it down to 10 distinct categories of competition, both road and rally, which I think have an important place, potentially, in the game. Some of them we have already had, some of them are hugely popular, in fact, many of these are hugely popular, and some of these have never been featured in the franchise. Now, the first one is one which I think is the most likely of all of the 10, and that's Super GT cars, JGTC or JPGT, in other words GT500s, GT300s, that kind of thing, especially the Japanese ones of course, like the GTRs, the Supras, etc. But of course there have been other countries, other teams that have entered. There was the HKS Mercedes CLK, I believe there was a Viper in there as well. I think the McLaren F1 even ran in like yellow and pink livery or something like that. There have been quite a few, and of course, famously, the Nomad Diablo as well, which was, of course, included in the franchise already. That was also a JGTC car. Now, this is a class which I believe there has already been some rumour about. I'm not sure, or I can't recall if it has already been confirmed for certain, but I believe there was a pretty strong rumour or something that people had noticed that I can't remember at the moment to indicate that it was coming back. And it's such an obvious thing. I mean, of all the classes of racing to come back, not that I'd necessarily want the most, but that makes the most sense, well, of course, it would be Super GT, because in Gran Turismo Sport's own way, we have the equivalents to stuff like LMP racing, in some cases actual LMP cars. Then we also have GT3 cars, and also some imitation ones, with a few touring car style machines in there as well, like the Impreza, the Evo, but it's kind of GT3-esque for the most part. Now, of course, the obvious choice of slotting right in between those two would be a Group 2 category for Super GT machines, JPGT, JGTC, etc. Even maybe some of the icons, like the old Calsonic Skyline. But as far as which ones they'd have, being as the game is focusing more on newer race cars, for the most part, with some very rare exceptions, it would seem obvious that they'd probably go for the newer Super GT machines, like GTRs for instance. If they were going to come back, which I do think they probably will, although we can't say when, really, I think that that would be more likely. Now, they might bring back some of the legends, like the Castrol Supra, or maybe the Esso Supra, I think it was, the Denso Sard Supra, which is one of my favourite liveries. Again, the Calsonic Skylines. Some others too, the Zexel, Loctite, Pennzoil. There are some great liveries, great teams. And even stuff like the Z cars, the 350Z for instance, or the REM Mamiya RX-7s. There are some great cars. Now, I don't think some of them have much of a chance of coming back. I would say stuff like, for instance, the Autobax Garaya doesn't have necessarily a huge chance. Something like a Mooncraft, for instance, a Mooncraft race car, I don't think that has much of a chance either. But the bigger dogs, like the Supras and the GTRs, I think they've got a reasonable chance. Maybe the RX-7, because of course they have featured that in the franchise for quite some time, even as far back as Gran Turismo 2 actually. But I'm not sure. I think they'd probably focus more on GT500 than GT300. And as you saw at the start of the video, incidentally, if you want to skip around through these different categories, you can do that by looking down at the timecodes in the description. But that's it for Super GT. I would say that it has a very strong chance of coming back. If it did return, who knows, it could have its own category. It might end up in Group 3. I don't think that's very likely, though, because if there's one thing that we can say for certain about especially the GT500 cars like the NSXs, the GTRs, the Supras, is that they are more often than not very fast. Often they are faster than GT3 cars, so it wouldn't really be fair, I don't think, to put them in that. So Group 2 is a pretty obvious choice because they're not LMP level. Usually, the GTRs can be in the right hands, but I think Group 2 would be kind of a no-brainer for Super GT, and that wouldn't surprise me at all. And as I said, I believe of all the ones on this list, that one's probably the most likely. The next one, and this is one that's close and personal to me, but I don't think has a particularly strong chance. I think we might get some cars from this category back, but not necessarily the category itself, and that's GT1. Now, of course, GT1 can vary, because in the 90s, GT1 was a very different thing to the early 2000s. In the early 2000s, if I recall, I think you had stuff like the Celine S7R, I believe that was a GT1, the MC12, what's the other one I was thinking of? The Corvette, I think the Corvette C6R was in that category, or the C5R possibly. But you've got some interesting stuff, but of course the 90s is really where it's at even, when it comes to GT1. Because you've got Panos, you've got the CLK GTR, you've got the Toyota GT1, the R390, you've got some awesome iconic machines, and definitely iconic ones for the franchise as well, in that sweet spot just after Group C and just before LMP 900s. Great cars in the category, plus, if you think about it, now that we have the Porsche license, imagine if they brought the Porsche 911 GT1. That would be pretty cool if we had that car. It wouldn't necessarily be the best thing out there, but considering it's one of the most dominant race cars of all time, especially GT1s, it would have a pretty good shot of being a really good car. Now again, the category, that might be an interesting one, because there is a precedent, a very clear and strong precedent in the game already, to have certain race cars which aren't in the same category in the same class. For instance, in Group 1, you have Vision GTs, which of course are fictional, and then the actual LMP cars going head-to-head. And that's something which we've discussed before. It's not entirely fair or accurate, really, to do that, but that's what they've chosen to do. And then in Group 3, a similar thing happens. You've got the real machines mixed in with fictional ones. Some of them vary more than others. So who knows, you could potentially get some GT1 cars, especially the early 2000s ones, where they weren't the hardcore homologation cars, they were really the modified road cars, like the Celine and the Maserati. They could potentially go in a Group 2 class against Super GT machines even, because they have a similar kind of performance, especially if you're comparing it to like a GTR, for instance. GT1s are, of course, more powerful, but still, some of those JGTC machines are incredibly quick, and all through the franchise, they've been some of the best cars in the game. The next one on the list is one which I personally don't have too much care for, but I know on Gran Turismo 6 and Gran Turismo 5, but especially 6, it has a very strong and loyal community, and that's NASCAR. There are a ton of people who love dirty NASCAR, clean NASCAR, really strict, rule-abiding NASCAR events on Gran Turismo 6 servers. In career mode, there's not a ton for NASCARs. There's like one event with a couple of races in there, but NASCAR has a huge following. Personally, as I've alluded to before on the channel, my interest in NASCAR is similar to my interest in F1, and that is I love the engineering and I love the tech, but I have no interest in the drivers or the race. I don't disrespect it. I know there are a lot of people who love to disrespect NASCAR. It's just 3 hours of turning left, or whatever the joke of the day is. Yeah, I can understand the joke, but at the same time, why don't you try taking a corner at 200 miles per hour for 2 hours? Something like that. You're going to make a mistake. And of course, a lot of people do watch for the mistakes and the crashes, but when it's done well, to have a bunch of cars going that fast, that close to each other, That's an incredible amount of skill, and Formula One never has something like that happening. You have all the cars next to each other on the grid, but that's pretty much it. You have some who immediately fall behind, some who immediately get ahead, some who crash, and then the race takes its time and does its thing. In NASCAR, it's just more of a constant thing. I still don't love it, but I can certainly see why people do. It's almost like a gladiator match, as far as motorsport goes. As I said, though, I love the tech of the cars. In particular, I have a lot of respect for the engineering of the engines, because, again, you have to know more than the average Joe about cars to really appreciate why a NASCAR is cool. Because building an engine that can do peak speed for that long, that's not easy. It's really not. F1 cars wouldn't be able to do that. They would just break. That's why F1s don't run in oval races, because they would just explode. Basically, a piston would probably go not just through the car, but through the driver as well. So it's incredible as far as reliability goes for the most part, but I think the event has a reasonable chance of coming back. I don't think it's probably their top priority, but given the massive fandom that NASCAR has, even in the game as well, regardless of the real world, I think there's a reasonable chance of them bringing it back. There's definitely more of a chance of getting NASCARs than there are GT1s. Unfortunately for me, but I know some people would be happy to hear that. And to be honest, I think that NASCARs probably have the second highest chance on this entire list, behind Super GT. I really do feel that that's the case, because there's been a precedent for featuring them. And again, even as far back as Gran Turismo 2, once again, you had the Taurus that you could convert into kind of a NASCAR. Visually it was, but the performance didn't match it. So there's a precedent there, and of course in GT5 and 6 it became a much stronger presence. Now, speaking of other cars that were featured on their own, another category that I think could be brought back is one which would please a lot of Australian fans, and that is V8 Supercars, Australia's answer to the DTM. Incredible performance cars. You've got the obvious stuff like Holden, or what's the other one? Well, Ford, I guess. But you've also got stuff like Merc and Volvo in there as well, so there's a pretty interesting European contingency in there also. We've already got Bathurst. Why not add a couple of other tracks? It's a very competitive form of racing. I've always found the visual appeal of V8 Supercars to be kind of similar to NASCAR. Obviously the tracks aren't the same, but the cars all having a very similar shape and the same kind of very colourful liveries and being very much so about the drivers. It's very reminiscent of NASCAR to me, almost like Australia's equivalent to it, but with a bit of cornering thrown in there as well. Or at least some right-hand corners. I've got to reinforce the stereotype myself, I guess. The next one on the list is one which, unfortunately, I think probably has one of the lesser chances, and I hate to say that because I would love to see this happen in either of the forms, and I'm technically talking about two different classes here, but I'm going to classify it as one, and that's trucks. Truck racing. And I'm not talking about pickup trucks like the Ford Raptor, I mean like the Mercedes tank pool race truck in Forza. Like a full-on haulage truck, like a Euro long-distance truck. That racing is awesome. I think it looks incredible. You've got these monstrous, massive torque machines with gears upon gears, rubber squealing all over the place. I love driving that tank pool truck on Forza. I love the truck racing. And again, kind of like NASCAR, it's one of those events where not everyone's going to love it, but those who do really do. And for me, I love driving massive, cumbersome, heavy cars. I always have. And that would certainly fall into that wheelhouse for me. However, I think there is a super slim chance that that will ever happen. I realistically don't think it will ever happen, because think about it, we have never had any kind of representation of trucks in the game. And that's a shame, because it's a very competitive form of racing. If it were added, I would be over the moon about that. Because although I don't support any particular driver or team, it's just such a cool visual difference, really, to have, with different physics, different skills, but just as much competition with these massive heavy machines that can just bash into each other. But at the same time, that's kind of part of the appeal. It's not just, being a douche about it. Now, the second part of that same one is also trucks, but this one is a bit more under the pickup style of things, and that's trophy trucks. I personally don't love trophy truck racing. Like, what I mean by that is like rally, basically, like Dakar stuff. Dakar, basically, those jacked up trucks. That would be cool, but I think in order to add that, you'd kind of need to bolster up the rally tracks as well, because running through those same, what is it, like 4 or 5 rally tracks that we've got, it can get boring real fast, especially because most of the tracks are so small, which is a shame. If they added something like Gran Turismo 5 had, with like full-on snow stages, sand even, imagine having desert stages, how cool would that be? And of course we have snow tyres in the game, but no snow tracks to use them on, which is kind of ironic. But yeah, I don't think trophy trucks have much of a chance. If I had the option, I would definitely choose the tank pool Mercedes-style trucks over trophy trucks, although I know a lot of people love those as well. Next up on the list, I'm putting a pretty obvious one, and we've already got one, Grand Prix. But I'm not necessarily going to dictate what era, because a lot of the newer stuff is dictated by licensing issues, especially the latest machines, whereas older stuff, like, in effect, Senna's Lotus, which we have on the game, kind of, that kind of stuff could be added, like the old Polyphony Formula cars from Gran Turismo 3. I don't think the Ferraris are going to return anytime soon, as cool as they are. The F10 in particular is a personal favourite of mine in the game. In the real world, I couldn't care less about it, but it's an awesome car in Gran Turismo 5. And even something like the Formula Gran Turismo, it's a great car, one of the quickest in the game. Grand Prix racing, especially if it had its own class. I mean, Group X is understandable, because it's the only car of its type in the game. But if we had enough to justify having its own category, maybe Group F for Formula cars, it would be awesome. Maybe subcategories, who knows, but at least one overall one. I think Grand Prix has a fairly slim chance. It's kind of more of a novelty at the moment, having that car in the game, although it's incredible to drive, albeit a bit too good sometimes. The next one, though, is kind of a follow-on, and this is one which I have a massive amount of love for, and in fact, of all of the ones here, this is probably my second most wanted, and that is vintage racing. Now, by vintage, I don't necessarily mean stuff like Ford Model Ts or patent motor wagons, as cool as they are. I'm talking more stuff like vintage Grand Prix, like from the real dangerous years of Grand Prix, like the 30s, where you had stuff like the Audi Streamliner being developed, but not the Streamliner that we have, because obviously that's not really a normal Grand Prix car, it's just a straight line machine really, but the ones which didn't have the Streamliner fairing, the ones from Mercedes, like I think it was the W203 or the W123 or something like that, W something, old school Mercs with the front engine layout, the old school Audis with the mid-engine layout, the big V16s and huge V8s, awesome old cars, most of them silver, the silver arrows of course, and performance which is totally different to anything else in the game, totally challenging, much more challenging than the Senna-style machine, that's for sure, because you're basically piloting an engine with a seat on top. There's not much else to it. It's like bicycle tyres and a Jay Leno tank car of an engine up front. Now, of course, they're not quite that big, but they're pretty big, and they're pretty powerful too. Now, if we got into that kind of stuff, imagine the beautiful machines you could have. You could have stuff like the old Bugattis, you could have the old Alphas. Now, I don't think that's ever going to happen, even though, of course, some of those, like the old Bugattis, actually are featured in the game, but only as a photo mode location, which is a shame, because some of those old Grand Prix machines are incredible to look at, they sound like nothing else, and as I said, they offer a completely different challenge. Up next, though, is another obvious one for me, as far as rallying goes, Pikes Peak. I mean, Pikes Peak has literally always been a part of the franchise. The Escudo, the Cultus. Even now, we do technically still have Pikes Peak. And funnily enough, the Pikes Peak Audi Quattro was the first classic car to be in Gran Turismo Sport, way before even the Cobra showed up. And that was cool because it was a harbinger of things to come. It gave those of us who are into classics, not just rally cars, but any classic car, a chance and a reason to be excited for what could come. And that's cool. I like to see that. Pikes Peak returning, I think, is a grey area, let's say. I think I heard something about the Pikes Peak potentially returning, but I'm not sure if that's just in my imagination or if I did hear that. I can't remember, so don't quote me on that, but I think I might have heard that some time ago. But I would be all on board, because of course Pikes Peak was featured on Gran Turismo 2, and the cars are just incredible. I mean, the Audi is cool, but as far as Pikes Peak cars go, it's pretty tame. That car has nowhere near the kind of power that the Escudo, the Cultus, and one of my personal favourites, the Tajima E-Runner. I mean, imagine if they brought the Tajima Mark II, the Rimac Tajima, which is, I believe, the most powerful Pikes Peak car ever. It's got like 15 or 1600 horsepower, an insane amount of torque. I think it set the record up the hill. Imagine if they finally brought the car that beat the Escudo in the real world, the Celica, the Pikes Peak Celica, or the Pikes Peak Tacoma, which is one of my personal favourites. That's an awesome looking car. I saw that at Goodwood crash. That wasn't as cool, but still, it's an awesome car. So Pikes Peak, I think, has a slim chance. There's certainly a precedent in the franchise for that to come back, but we'll have to wait and see. Next up is one which I think could definitely return. There is a precedent there, and if it did, I know a lot of people would be happy. In a similar way to the V8 Supercars, it is a very high-class touring car event, the DTM. DTM cars have almost always been in the franchise, if not always, actually, at least as far back as Gran Turismo 3. Before that, I'm not so sure. We did have touring cars, but I don't recall if we had any actual DTM ones. We had BTCC style stuff, like the Laguna and the Mondeo, but it wasn't until I think the CLK and the Astra and the Calibra... Oh, actually, yeah, of course we did. Yeah, the Calibra was on Gran Turismo 2, and the Alpha 155 was. So yeah, we did. We have always had DTM. So again, there's definitely a precedent there for it to come back. We've got some real legends, like the 190E from Mercedes. I think cars like that have a reasonable chance. There is that certain special thing about the 190E DTM car where it seems to just pop up on pretty much every racing game. Stuff like Project Cars has it as well. It's a pretty good handling car on there. It's a legend, and for good reason. Now, I know a lot of people would love to see one particular DTM car come back because it's literally the most highly requested car of all the suggestions on GTPlanet to return. The BMW E30 M3. But that one is for the road car, which I would prefer, but of course the DTM car is a legend as well. And the Ford as well, the Sierra RS500. How cool would it be to have those three legends go head to head? But then you got the later ones like the Calibra, the Alpha, which I have always loved those two, especially the Calibra. Then a little bit later again, you've got the Astra, the Mercedes CLK, which are great. The Mercedes has always been a fantastic handling car. But we've never had the new ones, like the new C-Class, the Vectra DTM car. And now, of course, we've gone even past those. I think there's like an M4 or something now from BMW. I don't follow the DTM, but I've seen just pictures and stuff. Mercedes C-Class Coupe, I guess, probably. Something like that. I don't find it as interesting nowadays, to be honest. It's like all racing is just becoming more and more similar to each other in terms of the way the cars look. But the early 2000s DTM, I think, for me, is the peak. They look awesome, and they have incredible performance. DTM, I think, has a reasonable chance of coming back. Maybe not in its own category, but it kind of does deserve to have its own, although I'm not sure what that would be. Then the next one is by far my most wanted. By far. Not even close. Group C. Group C Le Mans cars need to return to Gran Turismo. They are some of the most iconic cars of the franchise. They only started to be introduced on Gran Turismo 3, though. As far as I can recall, I don't believe we had any on Gran Turismo 1 or 2. We had GT1s, of course, the Toyota and the Nissan, but I don't recall any actual Group C cars. But then, with Gran Turismo 3, we were introduced to a legend, the 787B, the first Group C car of the franchise, at least as far as I can recall. And then, of course, on Gran Turismo 4, that's when it really took off. We had the Sauber C9, the Peugeot 905, the Jaguar XJR9. They really did go all out with that game, bringing in awesome stuff. The Nissan R89C, my personal favourite Group C car of all, the R92CP. Even stuff which never actually raced in the Le Mans, like the Toyota Minolta, which is a massive fan favourite. They are, and have always been, my favourite race cars as a class overall, because every single car there has the potential to win. And that's not necessarily something that you can usually say about a category that has so many disparate vehicles within the same regulations. Because if you're talking F1 or DTM, the cars are designed to be similar. That's the whole point. Whereas with the Group C, they were genuinely varied. The Porsche 962, for instance, is nothing like the Jaguar XJR9, which is nothing like the Peugeot 905, which is nothing like a 787B. And of course there are rule changes in there, especially in the early 90s where more and more F1 tech was coming in, with the Peugeot in particular. But again, they're all the overarching category of Group C. We need Group C to come back. And of course, in the 20 cars that I think have a strong chance of coming back, or at least a reasonable one, I did include cars like that. More so the Toyota, I think. The Toyota GT1, I would say, has a pretty strong chance of coming back. But yeah, I would adore it if Group C cars came back. And don't put them in Group X, please, Polyphony. That would be the best way to ruin it. It would still be awesome to have them, but yeah. And that's it. That's the 10 that I believe have a reasonable, sometimes low, sometimes high chance. Overall, I think that the Super GT has easily the highest chance. I think NASCAR has a pretty high chance. And I think touring cars of some kind at least, be it V8 Supercars, DTM, maybe something else like BTCC, has a pretty good chance as well. I'm not going to necessarily commit to one form of touring car, because they do vary quite a bit, but considering we don't really have any, you've got some which are like that, like the Mazda Atenza, or the Evo, or the Impreza, but even then, they're just mixed in with the others, it's not their own thing. And of course, they're not real either. So, that's it for my breakdown. Of course, there are tons of other categories, some of which I'd love to feature. Indy cars, for instance, or Group 6. I mean, my favourite race car of all time, spoiler alert for the Top 50 Countdown, the Howmet TX. That's a Group 6 car. The Chaparral 2D. And speaking of Chaparral, Can-Am. Anyone. The 2J, the Toyota 7, the Porsche 917-30 or whatever it was called, the most powerful Can-Am car ever. I believe actually the most powerful race car ever. Something like 1,500 horses. Can-Am would be awesome, and as much as I would love to feature it, I don't think it has a chance of coming back. I think that if we get any, it will be the Chaparral 2J, and I have a feeling that if we ever do get that back, it will probably be on its own in the game. I hope not, but realistically I think that will probably be the case. Can-Am would be awesome though. That really is a very competitive and pretty crazy form, but again, with the FIA stuff, it's unlikely. But overall, that's it for my countdowns. I guess it became 11 inadvertently because I hadn't thought about Can-Am. But yeah, those are the ones that I think have a reasonable chance. Of course, slap down below, you probably already have been commenting about which ones of these you'd like to see the most, maybe completely different ones that you'd like to see. There really are a ton of different classes once you think about it. And yeah, so that's it overall. Of course, you can check out other episodes in this series to have discussions about stuff like cars that I predict will be added, some of which have already been confirmed, vehicles which are self-driving, we had a discussion about that, various other things, game talk, YouTube talk, various other things as well, and of course various other videos on the channel specifically for GT Sport, be it reviews, tunes, blah 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 blah. So, I'll see you guys next time. And for now, as always, thanks for watching.